I was sitting at my dining room table at 10 o'clock at night, reading page 4 of a loan application my son-in-law had just slid across to me. Buried inside was $36,000 of personal debt that had nothing to do with my granddaughter's heart surgery. He sat smiling, already spending the money in his head. I closed the folder and said 5 words, "I am not signing this." His smile shattered. "But let me go back to the beginning. You'll miss everything that made it matter. I appreciate you settling in for this one. Before we begin, do something small for me. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever paid a price for someone who never knew it was you? Yes, no, and one line about why." I read every single one. A quick note: some details in this story are fictionalized to deepen the emotional impact. The lesson at its core is what matters most. The night my own daughter told me I wasn't a real father. I was standing 10 feet from the ICU where her baby was fighting to survive. A baby whose heart I had already paid to save twice. Though she didn't know that yet. The coffee in my hand had gone cold 20 minutes ago. I hadn't moved. The fluorescent lights in the pediatric corridor at Levine Children's Hospital turned everything the color of old paper. And the monitors behind the glass door beeped in a rhythm I had memorized over 6 months of standing in this exact spot. Antiseptic air. Tile floors. The low hum of machines keeping a 6-month-old alive. That was my world at 9:47 on a Thursday night in October. I'm 51 years old. I built a cybersecurity consulting firm in Charlotte from a folding table in my garage when I was 32. Maxed out on credit cards. Running on cold pizza and 4 hours of sleep. 20 years later, that firm employs 43 people and holds federal contracts I'm not allowed to talk about at dinner parties. I say this not to impress you, but so you understand I am not a man who folds easily. I have been threatened by competitors, audited by the IRS, and sued by a client who didn't like being told his network had more holes than a screen door. None of that prepared me for what happened next. My daughter came around the corner like a woman looking for a fight she'd already won in her head. Briar Kendrick, 28. Part-time dental hygienist, full-time hurricane. I adopted her when she was 11 months old, after my wife Colleen and I spent 6 years learning that biology wasn't going to cooperate with our plans. Briar has her mother's sharp jaw and a stubbornness that belongs to nobody but herself. I have loved her every single day of her life, including the day she stood in that hallway and tried to erase me. Hold on to that image. A man standing silent while his daughter erases him in a hospital hallway. Because everything I'm about to tell you will rewrite what you think happened here. Her husband was leaning against the wall behind her. Wade Kendrick, 31. Former mortgage loan officer who still dressed like he closed deals that hadn't existed in over a year. He had his phone in his hand and a look on his face that I'd been studying for 4 years. It was the look of a man who had just gotten exactly what he wanted, without saying a word. Briar stopped 3 feet from me. Her eyes were red, her hands were shaking, and then she said the 6 words I will hear for the rest of my life. "You're not her real father. You never were." Her voice cracked off the tile walls and died somewhere near the nurses' station. 2 nurses looked up. A respiratory therapist froze mid-step. Wade straightened against the wall and stepped forward, hands in his pockets, casual as a man checking the weather. "She's right, man. This isn't your call." I didn't respond. Not to him, not to her. I looked past both of them at the ICU door. Behind that glass, a baby the size of a Thanksgiving turkey was hooked to a cardiac monitor, breathing through a tube, her chest held together with surgical tape and whatever miracles Dr. Prescott had left in her hands. That baby was alive because of a check I wrote in secret 6 months ago and another one I wrote 3 weeks later. 2 checks totaling more than most families see in 5 years. My daughter didn't know about either one. Her husband had made sure of that. What do you do when the person you raised from infancy looks you in the eye and tells you you were never real? You do what I did. You breathe. You let the coffee go cold in your hand. And you remember what's behind that ICU door. because that door is the only thing that matters. And the woman screaming at you is the reason it matters, even if she's forgotten. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I looked at my daughter, and I looked at her husband, and I took a sip of coffee that tasted like nothing. That sentence, those 6 words, cost my daughter more than she could possibly imagine. And I promise you, by the end of this story, she knew exactly how much. But if I start here, you'll miss everything that made those words land like a grenade in a hospital hallway. You'll miss the money, the lies, the man who married my daughter and spent 4 years building a trap she couldn't see. You'll miss what I did about it, and what it cost me. And the one thing I never told anyone until it was almost too late, to understand why that sentence nearly destroyed me, and what it ultimately cost everyone who heard it. You need the last 6 months. It started on a Tuesday morning in May, the day my granddaughter was born, and everything changed. 8 months before that hallway, I was the kind of man who believed the hardest part of fatherhood was already behind me. I had a firm, 14 employees working out of a converted office suite in South Park, Charlotte, running cybersecurity audits for hospitals, regional banks, and 2 federal contractors whose names I still can't say out loud without a non-disclosure agreement getting nervous. I built that company from a folding table in my garage 18 years ago with 3 maxed-out credit cards and a wife who believed in me before the numbers did. Nobody handed me a contract. Nobody opened a door. I kicked them in, one after another, until the doors started opening on their own. My wife, Colleen Holt, 49, is a senior medical records administrator at a hospital system across town. She can organize chaos with her eyes closed and disarm a hostile room with a sentence. We've been married 26 years. We tried for children for 6 of them. Every test, every procedure, every empty nursery that stayed empty, no matter how many times Colleen rearranged the furniture, like changing the layout might change the outcome. When the doctor finally said it wasn't going to happen for us, we sat in the parking lot of that clinic and cried for 30 minutes. Then we drove home, ate dinner, and made a decision. We adopted Briar 11 months after she was born. We didn't settle for adoption. We arrived at it. There's a difference, and I need you to hold on to that. Because when someone throws that word around like it means less, like it makes a father something other than real, you need to understand what it actually cost us to earn it. 6 years of trying, 1 year of paperwork, and a lifetime of choosing her on purpose. Every single day, including the days she made it hard. That was my life before everything broke. A firm I built with my hands, a marriage that survived the things that sink most people, and a daughter I loved in the specific, stubborn way you love someone you fought to keep. Then there was Wade. Wade Kendrick married Briar 4 years before any of this started. He was 31, tall, good jaw, the kind of man who walks into a restaurant and checks his reflection in the window on the way in. He'd been a mortgage loan officer at a mid-sized brokerage in Charlotte until they let him go 2 years into the marriage. Compliance violations. The details were vague because Wade made sure they stayed vague. But I knew enough to know that when a brokerage fires a loan officer for compliance issues, the word they're not using is fraud. After the firing, he called himself a freelance financial advisor, which meant he picked up commission work when it came and spent the rest of the time performing success like a man auditioning for a role he'd already lost. Designer watch he couldn't afford. Shirts with French cuffs at a Tuesday dinner. A leased car that cost more per month than some of my employees' rent. Wade wore his ambition like a suit 2 sizes too big. Impressive from a distance. Obvious up close. And slowly cutting off circulation to everything underneath. I saw it. Colleen saw it. But Briar loved him. And when your daughter loves someone, you do what I did. You absorb it. You let the remarks slide. At a dinner at their place in Huntersville one evening, Wade poured himself a 3rd glass of wine and leaned back in his chair like a man about to deliver a keynote. No offense, Garrison, but cybersecurity consulting, he said, swirling the glass. That's basically IT help desk with a fancier title, right? He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed. Casual enough to deny, sharp enough to land. Breyer laughed. The kind of quick laugh that's more reflex than agreement. I looked at my plate and said nothing. In the car afterward, Colleen's sigh filled the cab of my truck before she even spoke. "You're going to let that slide?" she asked. "I always let it slide," I said. "That's what you do for family." She squeezed my forearm, not in agreement, in warning, as if she could already feel what I couldn't. The way a woman who's been married to you for a quarter-century can sense a storm before the sky changes. I let every remark slide. Every sideways glance at dinner, every joke about my work, every time Wade talked past me like I was furniture in my own daughter's house. I thought patience was the price of peace. I thought I understood the shape of my family and the people in it. I was wrong. And the proof was already growing inside my daughter, a heartbeat away from changing everything. Margot Kendrick arrived on a Tuesday in May. 6 pounds and 2 ounces of perfect, and for exactly 11 minutes. That's what she was. Breyer was still crying when they placed the baby on her chest. Happy tears. The kind that don't make sound, just roll down your face while you stare at this impossible thing you made. Wade had his phone out, filming, grinning like a man who'd just closed the biggest deal of his life. Colleen stood beside me in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, shoulders shaking. And I stood there watching my daughter hold her daughter for the first time. And something shifted in my chest that I hadn't felt since the day a judge signed Breyer's adoption papers 27 years ago. My daughter called me Dad, not my name. Not a title she was trying on for size, Dad. I held on to that syllable like a man holding a rope over a canyon. Because some part of me, the part that never fully unpacked from the years of infertility and the paperwork and the waiting, still needed to hear it. She has your stubbornness already, Colleen whispered, watching Margot's tiny fist grip Breyer's finger. Look at that grip! I laughed. Colleen squeezed my arm. The room smelled like new skin and sterile warmth, and the overhead lights hummed their fluorescent hum. And for 11 minutes, the world was exactly the shape I'd spent 51 years building it to be. 11 minutes. That's how long perfect lasted. Then Dr. Prescott walked in, and the air in that room changed temperature. Dr. Helene Prescott was 56 years old, a pediatric cardiac surgeon whose hands had repaired over 300 tiny hearts at Levine Children's Hospital. She entered without a smile, and that told us everything before her mouth opened. She was carrying a tablet with imaging results from a scan the neonatal team had flagged during the routine workup. She held it the way a person holds something heavy that isn't heavy. The echocardiogram identified a congenital defect in the aortic valve, she said. Her voice was steady, practiced. The kind of calm that comes from delivering this news more times than any human being should have to. It's severe, but operable. We're looking at open heart surgery within 3 to 4 weeks. Without intervention, her prognosis is measured in months, not years. Breyer's face didn't move. It froze. She looked down at Margot on her chest and then back at Dr. Prescott. And I watched my daughter travel from the happiest moment of her life to the most terrified in the time it took a surgeon to finish one sentence. Have you ever seen that happen to your child? Not when they're small and they fall off a bike and you scoop them up and the crying stops. When they're grown and they're holding their own baby. And a doctor just told them that the heart inside that baby isn't built right. There's no scooping. There's no fixing with a bandage. There's just standing in a doorway while your daughter's world breaks apart and knowing that the only tool you have is the one nobody in the room knows about yet. Money. The financial coordinator came in 40 minutes later. Clipboard, printed estimate. The apologetic posture of a woman whose entire job is to deliver numbers that ruin people. She walked through the insurance coverage. The caps, the exclusions, and then she landed on the number. $160,000. Beyond what insurance would cover. Due before surgery. Wade's voice cracked before his composure did. $160,000 after insurance. He looked at Breyer, then at the coordinator, then at the wall. Like the answer might be written somewhere he hadn't checked. That's not we don't who has that kind of money. I did. But I didn't say that. I watched my son-in-law's face turn the color of hospital sheets. I watched him do the math in real time. The math of a man whose income had been freelance commissions and optimism for 2 years. His leased car cost more per month than he'd admit, and his savings account, I suspected, looked exactly the way his former employer's compliance file did. Empty where it mattered. Breyer was still holding Margot. She hadn't spoken since Dr. Prescott left. Her eyes were fixed on the baby's chest, watching it rise and fall, counting heartbeats like each one might be rationed. That night, after the ward went quiet and Breyer finally fell asleep in the chair beside Margot's NICU bassinet, I sat in my truck in the parking garage and opened my banking app. The number was already in my head. I didn't call Colleen first. I didn't hesitate. I just started doing what I've always done when the people I love are in danger. I wrote the check nobody asked me to write. And I made sure nobody would ever know. At 7:14 the next morning, I called Levine Children's Hospital Financial Services and asked a question most grandfathers never have to ask. Do you accept anonymous payments for pediatric cardiac surgery? The woman on the other end paused, the way people pause when they're deciding whether to transfer you or answer you. I told her I wasn't looking for a tax receipt. I wasn't looking for a plaque on a wall or a mention in a newsletter. I wanted to pay for a specific patient's procedure, in full. And I wanted my name nowhere near the paperwork. She transferred me to the benefactor program. Forgot minutes later. I was on the phone with a coordinator who walked me through a wire routing process designed for exactly this kind of thing. Wealthy donors do it more often than you'd think. Hospitals are built for secrets. They just don't advertise that service on the brochure. I wired the money before lunch. Watched the confirmation appear on my phone screen in the parking lot of my own office. My thumb still hovering over the button, like the transaction might reverse itself. It didn't. The number disappeared from my account and reappeared in a system that would never connect it to my name. My daughter. Or the son-in-law who'd spent last night asking who has that kind of money while standing 6 feet from a man who did. That evening I told Colleen. She was standing at the kitchen counter, still in her work badge, pouring a glass of wine she hadn't earned yet but definitely needed. I said the number. Her hand stopped mid-pour. $160,000, she said. Not a question, a reckoning. Will we be okay? We'll be fine. Margot will be fine. That's all that matters. She set the bottle down, looked at me the way she looks at me when she's calculating not the money, but the cost. Will Breyer ever know? Not important. What's important is that heart keeps beating. $160,000. Say that number out loud. That's a house down payment in most of this country. That's 4 years of state college tuition. I wired it before lunch and told exactly one person on earth. And that person was standing in front of me with a wine glass and a look that said she married a man who would do this, and she wasn't surprised, just scared. Colleen didn't argue. She understood the math. Not the financial kind, the fatherhood kind. Some bills you pay because you can. Some you pay because nobody else will. And some you pay knowing that the moment anyone finds out, the love behind it gets rewritten as control. We made a pact that night. Breyer would never feel like a charity case in her own family. The money came from the hospital's benefactor fund. End of story. 3 weeks later. Dr. Prescott operated on Margot's heart. I have built a company. I have survived audits and lawsuits and the kind of pressure that turns most men into drinkers or quitters. None of it prepared me for a surgical waiting room. 7 hours in a chair that smelled like disinfectant and other people's fear. Watching a clock that moved like it was being paid by the hour. Colleen sat beside me. Breyer paced. Wade sat in the corner, scrolling his phone, bouncing his knee. Performing calm the way he performed everything else. Watching your granddaughter come out of open-heart surgery is like watching the sunrise after a night you were certain would never end. You don't celebrate. You just stand there shaking. Grateful the world still turns. Dr. Prescott came out in scrubs, mask pulled down, regardless, and delivered the news with the steady precision of a woman who does this for a living, but never lets it become routine. The repair went well, but this type of defect often requires a second intervention within 6 to 9 months. I need you all to prepare for that possibility. Breyer sobbed into Colleen's shoulder. Wade exhaled and checked his phone. And then Breyer said something that landed in my chest like a stone. Thank God for that hospital fund. I don't know what we would have done without it. She was thanking a fund that didn't exist. Thanking strangers who were actually her father. And I stood there and let her. Because the alternative was worse. Dr. Prescott shook my hand on the way out. Her grip was firm, professional, and it lasted 2 seconds longer than a surgeon's handshake should. She looked me in the eye with an expression that had nothing to do with medicine. Your granddaughter is a fighter, she said. She gets that from somewhere. She knew. I don't know how. Maybe the benefactor coordinator talked. Maybe the timing was too obvious. Maybe surgeons who save 300 tiny hearts develop an instinct for the people who pay for them. But she knew, and now the only person outside my marriage who held this secret was the woman who held the scalpel. I stood in the doorway of my daughter's house that Saturday and listened to her thank God that no one had stepped in to help her. Not knowing the man standing 6 feet away was the only reason she still had a house to be grateful in. I wasn't worried about the surgeon keeping my secret. Dr. Prescott was a professional, and professionals understand discretion the way amateurs understand volume. The secret was safe with her. But secrets have a weight to them. And by July, that weight had settled into a spot just below my sternum, where it sat like a stone every time I walked into my daughter's house. I drove out to Huntersville on a Saturday afternoon to check on Margot. She was 2 months old now, recovering well, sleeping in a bassinet in the living room with a tiny surgical scar running down her chest like a zipper on the smallest jacket in the world. I brought groceries. I always brought groceries. It was the kind of help you could offer without it feeling like help. And that distinction mattered in a house where my son-in-law treated assistance like an insult. I was in the hallway, still holding the bags, when I heard them talking in the kitchen. Honestly, babe, thank God for that hospital fund, Wade said. I could hear the refrigerator door open and close. At least we didn't have to go begging to your old man. That would have been humiliating. He would have helped if we asked, Breyer said. He always does. Sure. And we'd never hear the end of it. I stood there, with the grocery handles cutting into my fingers, and my jaw locked so tight I could feel my back teeth grinding. The man who just said he'd rather die than ask me for help was standing in a kitchen I could have bought twice over, holding a baby who was alive because I didn't wait to be asked. Let me be clear about something. I didn't pay that money so someone would thank me. I didn't wire 6 figures to a hospital so I could hold it over Wade's head at Thanksgiving. But hearing the man I paid for actively celebrate not needing me while I was holding his groceries in the hallway, that is a specific kind of silence you carry home in your chest. It doesn't go away. It just sits there, next to the stone, and waits. I walked in, set the bags on the counter, kissed Margot's forehead, drank half a glass of sweet tea I didn't taste. Breyer showed me how the baby had started tracking faces with her eyes. And for 20 minutes, the world was just a grandfather watching his granddaughter learn to see. Then Breyer took Margot upstairs for a nap, and the house got quiet the way houses do when a baby is the reason everyone moves carefully. I was heading for the front door when I heard Wade's voice coming from the back porch. Low, urgent. not the voice of a man catching up with a friend. The porch light was off. Wade didn't know I was 3 steps behind the screen door, and what I heard next had nothing to do with baby formula. "I told you I'd have it by August," he said, pacing. His phone screen lit his face from below, carving shadows under his eyes that made him look 10 years older. "I just need no. Listen, I can't pull from that right now. There are eyes on it." A pause. Someone talking back. Wade's free hand was balling into a fist and releasing. Balling and releasing. The rhythm of a man trying to keep his voice steady while his body screamed. "I know what I owe. You don't have to keep reminding me. Just give me 4 more weeks." He hung up without saying goodbye. Stood on the dark porch for a moment, head tilted back, staring at a sky he wasn't seeing. Then he shoved the phone in his pocket and walked back inside. He passed within 2 feet of me in the hallway and didn't notice. His eyes were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that had nothing to do with his recovering daughter upstairs, and everything to do with whatever hole he'd been digging long before Margot was born. That wasn't a man talking about diapers or medical bills. That was a man negotiating with a debt that predated his daughter's heartbeat. And the phrase that stuck to me like tar on a hot road was 5 words long. I can't pull from that. Pull from what? What account? What fund? What source of money did Wade have access to that someone else was watching him? I didn't confront him. I didn't mention it to Colleen. I drove home on I-77 with the windows down and the cicadas screaming and that sentence looping in my skull. From that night on, I started paying very close attention to my son-in-law. And what I found, eventually, was worse than anything I'd overheard on a porch. A month after my granddaughter's heart was cut open and stitched back together, we threw her a party. And the only person in that room whose chest was still cracked open was her father. I'd spent those 4 weeks watching Wade the way you watch a stock you suspect is being manipulated. Quietly, from a distance, noting the patterns without tipping the market. The phone call on the porch had given me a frequency to tune into, and once you hear that frequency, you can't unhear it. Every time Wade laughed too quickly, checked his phone too often, or steered a conversation away from money, I filed it. I didn't know what I was building yet, but I knew I was building something. The homecoming party was at Breyer and Wade's place in Huntersville. Pastel balloons pressed against the kitchen ceiling. Casseroles lined the counter. 4 different neighbors had dropped off the same chicken and rice recipe in different colored dishes. Margot was almost 2 months old, recovering beautifully, wearing a tiny onesie that said "tiny but mighty" and a medical bracelet on a wrist no wider than my thumb. I held her against my chest and felt her heartbeat through the blanket. Steady, strong. The surgeons work holding firm under skin so thin you could almost see the pulse. Whatever else was falling apart in that house. This heartbeat was proof that something had been done right. Colleen circulated the room the way she does, making everyone feel seen without drawing attention to herself. Byers smiled and accepted hugs and looked for the first time since May like a woman who believed her daughter was going to be okay. It was a good room, a warm room. The kind of afternoon that's supposed to mean the worst is behind you. The balloons were doing most of the emotional heavy lifting in that room, and the humans underneath them were barely holding air themselves. It wasn't quite a party where nobody was happy. But Wade was working hard to make it one. He was on his 3rd beer by 2 o'clock. Not staggering, not sloppy, but loosened in the way that makes careful men careless. He'd positioned himself by the kitchen island, holding court with 2 neighbors. His voice a half register too loud. "You guys have no idea what diapers cost now," he said, gesturing with the bottle. "Add in the specialists, the follow-ups, the co-pays for every little thing. I mean, we're grateful, obviously. But nobody tells you fatherhood is basically financial suicide." One of the neighbors laughed politely. The other took a long sip of lemonade. Breyer appeared beside him and touched his arm. The kind of touch that looks supportive and is actually a leash. "Wade, Stop. People are going to think we're broke. I'm kidding, he said. Mostly. He wasn't kidding. I'd spent 20 years in business reading the distance between what men say about money and what money is actually doing to them. Wade was drowning. The jokes about diapers were a life raft he was waving at a room full of people who didn't know they were watching a man go under. Pay attention to the man who complains about money at his own daughter's homecoming party. He's not venting. He's confessing. Just not to the right audience. The right audience was sitting in a lawn chair on the patio, holding his granddaughter, counting every tell like a man running a security audit. Which, in a sense, I was. Over the next 2 hours, I watched Wade excuse himself 3 times. Each time he stepped into the garage, phone pressed to his ear, door pulled shut behind him. Each call lasted between 4 and 7 minutes. Each time he came back, his smile was a little tighter, his grip on the bottle a little harder, the performance a little more brittle. Colleen noticed too. She put her hand on my knee under the table during the cake cutting, and I knew exactly what that hand meant. It meant she'd been watching the same thing I had. It meant we'd talk about it in the car. We cut the cake. Briar held Margot up for a photo, and the baby grabbed at a balloon string, and everyone laughed the way you laugh when a baby does something small and perfect. I smiled for the picture. I held Margot one more time before we left and felt that heartbeat against my palm, steady and sure. But in my head, I was already running numbers, not hospital numbers, Wade numbers, 3 secret phone calls, 2 garage trips that lasted too long. One moment, right before the cake, where Wade stared at his own daughter's medical bracelet like it was an invoice he couldn't pay. I didn't have enough yet, but a few days later, Wade gave me exactly the opening I'd been waiting for. He called me directly for the first time in 4 years of marriage to my daughter and asked if I wanted to get coffee. He had a proposition, he said. Something about Margot's future. Men like Wade don't call their fathers-in-law about the future. They call when the present has run out of options. Wade Kendrick bought me a $6 latte, sat across from me in a booth by the window, and asked me for $75,000 without once looking me in the eye. The coffee shop was in South Park, a mile from my office. He'd texted the day after the homecoming party, casual as a man confirming a tea time. Got an idea I want to run past you. About Margot's future. Coffee tomorrow? I said yes because the fastest way to understand what a man wants is to let him ask for it. He was already seated when I arrived. Fresh haircut, too much cologne, a button-down shirt with French cuffs at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday. Wade dressed for conversations the way other men dressed for court appearances, overdone. Deliberate, armored. I've been thinking long-term, he said, stirring a coffee he hadn't sipped. Margot's gonna need follow-up care for years. Specialists. Monitoring. Maybe more procedures. I want to set up something, a fund, an account, whatever, and I think $75,000 would give us a real cushion. He delivered it smoothly, rehearsed, the way a man pitches a deal he's been practicing in the shower. But he left gaps the size of doorways, and I walked through every one of them. What kind of account? I asked. Where would it be held? Who manages withdrawals? 3 questions. He didn't have an answer for any of them. His eyes went to the window, then the door, then back to me. I mean, I'd handle it, Briar and I. It's our daughter. Here's a lesson I learned building a cybersecurity firm from nothing. When someone asks you for money and can't tell you where it's going, the answer is always the same. It's going somewhere they don't want you to see. I've sat across from hospital CFOs who tried to hide a data breach behind budget jargon. I've watched contractors quote phantom expenses with the same steady voice Wade was using right now. The pitch changes. The pattern never does. Vague language, no documentation. Urgency dressed up as planning. And always, always, the assumption that you'll say yes because saying no feels rude. I let him talk for another 5 minutes. He used the word investment 4 times and the word Margot 6. He never once mentioned a specific medical provider, a specific cost projection, or a specific financial institution. He mentioned himself 11 times, I counted. His fingers were shredding a paper napkin under the table. He thought I couldn't see it. I could. The same way I could see the sweat line forming at his collar. The way his right knee bounced under the booth. The way his eyes kept flicking to the door like a man calculating his exit before the meeting was over. A man with a real plan brings a spreadsheet. A man with a scheme brings a smile. Wade had a beautiful smile. It was the most expensive thing about him. I set my mug down. "I'll do better than 75,000, I said. "I'll set up a trust in Margot's name. Proper legal structure, independent trustee, transparent accounting. Every dollar goes directly to her medical care. Nothing gets diverted. Nothing gets touched without documentation." The word trust did it. Not trust as in faith. Trust as in legal document. Third-party oversight. Paper trail. That single word turned my son-in-law's face the color of the napkin he was shredding. "That's your overcomplicating this," he said, leaning back like the booth had gotten smaller. "I'm her father. You don't need a lawyer between me and my daughter's money." "It's not between you and her money," I said. "It's between her money and everyone else. That's what a trust does." He stood up so fast his chair scraped the tile. The latte he'd bought me was still full, the foam going flat. He buttoned his jacket, a gesture so automatic it was almost sad. The uniform of a man who dressed for success long after success had stopped returning his calls. "I was trying to do this the right way," he said. "For Margot. So am I." He walked out like a man late for a fire he'd started himself. The espresso machine hummed behind the counter. Traffic crawled past the South Park window. I sat there for another 10 minutes, finished my latte, and thought about what had just happened. He didn't want an investment account. He didn't want a trust. He wanted cash. Untraceable, unaccountable, urgent. $75,000, with no paper trail and no questions asked. Dressed up in his daughter's name like a gift he was wrapping for someone else entirely. The only question left was whether Briar knew. Whether she was part of the ask or part of the cover. I didn't have to wait long for the answer. That evening my phone rang, and my daughter's voice came through the speaker sharp enough to cut glass. My daughter called me that evening not to ask how I was doing, but to tell me what kind of father I was. None of the words she used were kind. I was in my home office, jacket still on, the taste of that $6 latte still sitting in my throat, when her name lit up my phone. I answered the way I always answered Briar's calls. With hope. "Dad." Wade told me what happened. Her voice was already at altitude, the kind of sharp that doesn't build it, arrives fully formed. Preloaded. Aimed. "He asked you for help. For your granddaughter. And you turned it into some kind of legal interrogation. Do you have any idea how that made him feel?" "Briar, I didn't say no. I said let's do it properly." "Properly, you mean your way. You always mean your way." She was pacing. I could hear it in the way her breath caught between sentences. The way the background noise shifted like she was moving room to room, burning energy she didn't have. "He came to you with a real idea, a real plan for Margot's future, and you treated him like a suspect." I closed my eyes. The pitch she was describing bore no resemblance to the conversation I'd had 4 hours ago. Wade hadn't brought a plan. He'd brought a number and a smile and hoped I wouldn't ask questions. But the version Briar had received was polished, rewritten. The kind of revisionist history that only works when you tell it to someone who already wants to believe you. "He's her father. Dad. Not you." Listen carefully to those words. He's her father, not you. She meant Margot. But what she was really saying, what Wade had coached her to say without her knowing she'd been coached, was that I had no right to protect my own granddaughter from the man who was supposed to be doing it. 2 words. Not you. She didn't know it yet, but she was rehearsing. Practicing for a line she'd deliver in a hospital hallway 2 months later that would land like a fist to the sternum. The script was already being written. Wade was holding the pen. Briar, if you'd let me explain what actually... I don't need you to explain. I need you to trust my husband. I need you to stop acting like you're the only person in this family capable of making a decision. Margot is our daughter. Ours. And if Wade says he has a plan, then he has a plan. You don't get to audit our lives because you built a company. She hung up. No goodbye, no pause, just the click and the silence and the dial tone buzzing in my ear like a flat line. When your daughter hangs up on you mid-sentence, do you call back? Do you text? Or do you sit there holding a dead phone, wondering at what point the child you raised started taking orders from someone who doesn't deserve her? I sat there. I chose option 3. Colleen found me 20 minutes later. I was still in my office chair, phone face down on the desk, staring at my own reflection in the dark window. She stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway light. And she didn't ask what happened. She read it off me the way she reads everything. Silently, accurately, completely. What did she say? She asked. What he told her to say. Colleen came in and sat on the arm of the leather chair across from mine. Her hand found my shoulder, and her fingers smelled like the lavender lotion she puts on every night before bed. She was quiet for a moment. Maybe we should just tell her the truth, she said. About the money, about all of it. If she knew what you did... Not yet. Why not? Because if I tell her now, it looks like I'm buying the argument, like I'm cashing in a receipt to win a fight. The truth has to come out on its own terms. Colleen, not as a weapon, not as leverage, on its own terms. She looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded, the way she nods when she disagrees with my timing but trusts my math. I could have ended it that night. 1 sentence. I paid for your daughter's surgery, Briar, every dollar. The charity fund doesn't exist. That sentence would have silenced every accusation, reversed every insult, rewritten every lie Wade had planted. But the right truth at the wrong time is just another kind of manipulation. And I had spent 28 years being Briar's father without conditions. I wasn't about to start attaching them now. I set the phone face down on my desk and let the silence settle. Wade wasn't just hiding debt anymore. He was building a wall between me and my daughter. Brick by brick. Insult by insult. And the worst part was that it was working. But 2 weeks later, a doctor's appointment would change the math entirely. The doctor's appointment came 2 weeks later, and it changed the math the way a wrecking ball changes a building. We walked into that checkup expecting good news for adults smiling in a waiting room, pretending the last 2 weeks hadn't happened, and walked out carrying a number that would break one of us and bankrupt the other. Margot was 4 months old. She'd been gaining weight, sleeping longer, hitting the milestones the pediatrician wanted to see. Briar had started posting photos online again, captioned with phrases like, "Our little fighter," and "Stronger every day." The narrative was recovery. The narrative was wrong. Dr. Prescott pulled up the imaging on the lightbox and didn't bother with small talk. She pointed to the valve, traced the area with her pen, and delivered the news the way a surgeon delivers news precisely, without flinching, and without leaving room for interpretation. "The imaging shows accelerated deterioration in the repair site," she said. "We can't wait the 6 months I originally projected. I'm recommending we schedule the second procedure within 3 weeks. Delay beyond that introduces significant risk of acute heart failure in an infant this size." The room didn't just go silent. It emptied. All the warmth, all the hope, all the recovery narrative Briar had been building on Instagram and in her head, it left through the walls like air from a punctured tire. 3 weeks, not 3 months, 3 weeks. The heart had rewritten the calendar, and nobody in that room had a vote. Briar clutched Margot tighter, her fingers pressing into the blanket like she could hold the diagnosis at bay with her grip. 3 weeks. You said we had months. You said the heart changed the timeline, Dr. Prescott said. Not me. Colleen reached for my hand under the chair. I took it. Her fingers were cold, which meant the fear had already reached her bloodstream. I squeezed once, and she squeezed back. And that was the entire conversation we needed to have in that moment. We'd been married long enough to speak in pressure. I looked at Wade. He was sitting in the chair closest to the door, which I'd noticed was where he always sat in rooms that made him uncomfortable. His eyes weren't on Margot. They weren't on Briar. They weren't on the imaging scan still glowing on the light box. They were fixed on the financial coordinator's folder sitting on the edge of Dr. Prescott's desk. The folder with the estimate in it. The folder he knew was coming. Dr. Prescott excused herself. The financial coordinator came in. She was a woman in her 40s, with a clipboard and the apologetic posture of someone whose entire job is to deliver numbers that ruin people's afternoons. She walked through the insurance caps, the exclusions, the out-of-pocket projections, and then she said the number, $180,000, beyond what insurance would cover, due before the procedure. I want you to picture this. A mother holding a baby with a failing heart, crying. A grandmother gripping her husband's hand under a plastic chair, and a father, the baby's actual father, staring at a dollar amount like it personally offended him. That's what saw. And that's when I knew, with the kind of certainty you can't unlearn, exactly who Wade Kendrick was. 180,000, Wade said. His voice was flat, mechanical, emptied of everything except arithmetic. On top of what we already, is there a payment plan? Some kind of anything? Briar looked at him. The tears were still wet on her face. And for 1 second, just one, I watched something shift behind her eyes. Not anger, not betrayal, something quieter. The first hairline crack in a wall she'd been reinforcing for 4 years. Wade. She could die, Briar said. That's what you're hearing right now. The price? He didn't answer. He looked at the folder, then at the floor, then at the door he was already seated closest to. Briar looked away. The crack sealed itself over. Not gone, just papered. We drove home in separate cars that afternoon. Colleen didn't speak for 20 minutes. The highway hummed under the tires, and the air conditioning blew cold against the silence. And I waited. Because Colleen speaks when she's ready. Not when you want her to. He didn't touch the baby once, she said finally. During that entire appointment, not once. She was right. Wade hadn't held Margot, hadn't looked at her chart, hadn't asked Dr. Prescott a single medical question. He'd asked about payment plans, $180,000 hanging over his daughter's heartbeat. And the only math he was running was whether someone else would pick up the bill. I had a feeling I knew exactly who he had in mind. I was halfway down the pediatric corridor with a stuffed rabbit for my granddaughter when Wade Kendrick stepped into my path and started shouting. It didn't build. There was no preamble, no greeting, no pretense of civility. He came around the corner from the waiting area like a man who'd been pacing and planning, and he planted himself in the middle of the hallway and let it fly. You don't care about Margot, he said, loud enough that a nurse at the station looked up from her screen. You care about being the hero. You care about making me look small. That's all you've ever done. I stopped walking. The stuffed rabbit was in my left hand, gray with floppy ears, a bow around its neck. I'd bought it because Margot had started grabbing at soft things. I held it at my side and let him empty the entire clip. Nurses froze behind the desk. A janitor stopped mopping and stood watching. It took about 90 seconds. When he was done, his chest was heaving, and the hallway was so quiet I could hear the mop water dripping off the bucket. Then I spoke. Are you finished? I kept my voice low. Not a whisper, Low. The kind of low that makes people lean in instead of step back. Because I want to be very clear about something. I will be here for Margot every single day of her life. That is not negotiable. But I will not stand in a children's hospital and let you shout at me like I'm the problem in this family. Not today. Not again. Wade's jaw tightened. Or what? Or you'll find out what happens when I stop being patient. I held his eyes. I didn't blink. And Wade, I've been patient for a very long time. I looked past him and saw my daughter. She was standing 10 feet behind Wade, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her own body together. I don't know how long she'd been there. Her eyes were red. She looked at her husband, then at me, then at the floor. She was 28 years old, and she looked 12. Caught between two men and choosing the floor. She didn't defend Wade, she didn't defend me. She just stood there. And somehow that was the part that hurt the most. Because silence from your daughter when you need her voice is its own kind of verdict. I walked past both of them. Down the corridor, past the nurses who pretended to be reading charts, past the janitor who'd started mopping again. I set the stuffed rabbit on the shelf beside Margot's bassinet and pressed my lips to the glass. She was sleeping, her chest rising and falling, the monitors blinking green. She didn't know about any of this. She didn't know about the shouting, or the money, or the man in the hallway who'd rather scream at her grandfather than hold her. I left without another word, in the parking lot. The September heat hit me like a wall. I was reaching for my truck door when I heard footsteps behind me. Fast, deliberate. Briar. She wasn't crying anymore. She was something worse. She was thinking. Her arms were crossed, her jaw set, and when she stopped beside my truck, she leaned against the passenger door and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not anger, not sadness, something clinical. Something she'd been assembling in her head during the walk from the corridor to the asphalt. What she said next told me exactly how deep Wade's poison had gone. And it told me that the word I'd been dreading, the one I'd carried like a splinter since the day I signed adoption papers 27 years ago, had finally found its way into my daughter's mouth. My daughter looked at me in that parking lot the way you look at someone you're about to hurt on purpose. Not with anger, with the careful aim of someone who knows exactly where to cut. She leaned against the passenger side of my truck, arms crossed. The September sun turning the asphalt into a griddle beneath our feet. The metal panel behind her was hot enough to burn, but she didn't flinch. She'd come out here with something to say, and she was going to say it standing still. I'm not trying to hurt you. Dad. Her voice was quiet, controlled, more dangerous than shouting ever could be. But sometimes I wonder, if I were your real daughter, your biological daughter, would you trust Wade more? Would you trust me more? Or is there always going to be this distance? She said it like a thought she'd been carrying for 28 years that finally fell out of her hands in a hospital parking lot. Not rehearsed, not weaponized, just exhausted. A question she'd never let herself ask out loud until the pressure cracked the seal. I stood there holding my keys, and every response I'd ever prepared for this moment vaporized in the heat. I wanted to say, I chose you. I chose you before you could open your eyes. I wanted to tell her about the day the judge signed her papers, and I held her in the courthouse hallway and she grabbed my thumb and wouldn't let go. I wanted to say that biology is an accident and fatherhood is a decision, and I made mine 27 years ago and never once looked back. But the words wouldn't come, because she'd already turned her back and was walking across the lot toward her car. And some truths need more than hot asphalt and hurt feelings to land properly. If you've ever adopted a child, you know this fear. It lives in the back of every good day, every birthday, every time they say, I love you, Dad, and you believe it completely. The fear that one day they'll look at you and ask the question you cannot answer with evidence. The question that biology answers for free, and adoption has to earn every single day. Breyer didn't say, "You're not real," not yet. But she came close enough to draw blood. And the wound she opened wasn't new. It was the oldest one I had. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes with the engine running and the air conditioning blowing against the silence. Then I went inside and told Colleen. She was in the kitchen. I said Breyer's words exactly as they'd been spoken. No editorializing, no cushion. Colleen set down the dish towel and leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. "She doesn't mean it," Colleen said. "She's scared, and Wade is feeding her every insecurity she's ever had." I know she's scared. But scared people still choose their words. Colleen. And those were chosen. She opened her eyes. She didn't argue. She saw what I saw, that the remark wasn't entirely Wade's script. There was something underneath it that belonged only to Breyer. Something planted long before Wade arrived. A seed that had been dormant for decades and was now being watered by a man who understood exactly how to grow it. Patience is a muscle. I'd been training it for 28 years. But that night, standing in my home office at 11 o'clock, with the house dark and Colleen asleep down the hall, I stopped training and started using it. Not to endure, to build. I picked up the phone and called Simone Gallagher. She was 44. A trust and estate litigation attorney who billed by the quarter hour and never wasted a single one. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been working. Lawyers like Simone were always working. "Simone, I need 2 things," I said. "First, establish a trust in my granddaughter's name, Margot Kendrick. Independent trustee. Full transparency. No signatory access for the parents. Second, I need you to look into my son-in-law's financial history, quietly. Everything he owes, and everyone he owes it to." There was a pause, the sound of a pen being uncapped. "How deep do you want me to go?" "Until you hit bottom." "I don't think it's far." I hung up at 11:47. The house was quiet. I sat in my office chair and looked at the framed photo on my desk, Breyer at 3 years old, on my shoulders at the Charlotte Zoo. Laughing so hard her face was red and her hands were tangled in my hair. That little girl never once wondered if I was real. Someone taught her to wonder, and I was done letting him teach. I gave my son-in-law exactly 6 weeks to dig his own grave. He didn't need half that long. 3 weeks into Simone's investigation, Wade Kendrick did me the favor of bringing the evidence directly to my dining room table. It started with a phone call from Breyer. Casual tone. Rehearsed phrasing. The kind of voice a daughter uses when she's delivering bad news wrapped in tissue paper. Wade had lost his last freelance commission. A commercial property referral deal that fell through when the buyer walked. She called it a slow quarter. In my business. When a man loses every client in 12 months and calls it a slow quarter, we call it something else. We call it over. Wade Kendrick had no income, no pipeline, no prospects, and a daughter whose second heart surgery was weeks away, with a price tag he couldn't cover with everything he owned. Colleen stood in the kitchen doorway after I hung up, reading my face the way she always does. "She's covering for him," Colleen said. "She's been covering for him since the wedding. She just doesn't know it yet." 4 days later. Wade requested a family meeting. His words, not a visit, not dinner, a meeting. He arrived at our house in Myers Park with Breyer and a manila folder thick enough to have a spine. He was wearing a new shirt, cuffs buttoned, collar pressed. The costume of a man who wanted to be taken seriously by someone who'd stopped taking him seriously months ago. "I've run a cybersecurity firm for 18 years. My entire career is built on reading documents that other people hope you'll sign without looking. I've caught hospital administrators hiding 6-figure data breaches inside budget variance reports. I've watched contractors bury phantom expenses on page 9 of a 12-page invoice, hoping nobody made it past page 3. Wade Kendrick walked into my house with a stack of paper and expected me to do what every Mark does. Trust the man holding the pen. He sat at my dining room table, opened the folder, and slid it across to me. $90,000. A personal loan from a high-interest private finance company I'd never heard of, requiring my signature as co-signer. This is about Margot's future, he said, rehearsed, smooth, the voice of a man who'd practiced in the car. Long-term care, follow-ups, specialists. I've mapped it all out. I just need your signature as co-signer. Your credit, not your money. I didn't answer. I opened the folder and started reading. Not skimming, reading. The way I read every contract that crosses my desk. The way I've read every document that's ever been put in front of me by someone who hoped I wouldn't. Page 1 was clean. Projections for pediatric follow-up care. Reasonable numbers. Medical-sounding language. Page 2 was the loan terms. High interest. Short repayment window. The kind of structure that benefits the lender and punishes the borrower. Page 3 was the repayment schedule. Page 4. That's where every con artist buries the lie. Deep enough that most people never turn that far, but shallow enough that the fine print still protects the lender. Wade wasn't a good con artist. He was just a desperate one. I see a debt consolidation line on page 4, I said, not looking up. It references a balance predating Margot's birth by 18 months. What's that for? The room temperature dropped 3 degrees. I could feel it. That's it's grouped in, Wade said, for efficiency. The bank suggested. Which bank? Because the lender listed here is a high-interest private finance company, not a bank. Silence. Wade's fingers went to his cuffs. Adjusting, fidgeting, the small mechanical motions of a man whose script just ran out of pages. I kept reading. Page 7 projected medical costs 40% higher than what Levine's financial office had quoted us. The consumer complaint rating on the lender would have made my compliance team walk out of the room. And buried inside the consolidation structure was $36,000 of personal debt that had nothing to do with my granddaughter's heart. He wasn't borrowing from Margot. He was laundering his own failure through her name. Using a baby with a heart defect as a cover story for debts he'd been dragging behind him like an anchor since before she was born. I closed the folder, set it on the table, looked at Wade. He was smiling. The same smile he wore the day he married my daughter. Confident, rehearsed, already spending the money in his head. I slid the folder back across the table. I'm not signing this. His smile didn't fade. It shattered, like a pane of glass hit from behind, the fracture lines spreading outward from the center of his face until there was nothing left but the frame. And for the first time, Briar saw it too. She was sitting beside him, and I watched her eyes move from me to Wade and catch the exact moment her husband's face stopped performing and started panicking. She saw it. She didn't say a word, but she saw it. I watched it happen in real time, the exact moment Wade realized I could see straight through the con, and that it had never been as clever as he thought. Wade's smile didn't just fall. It disassembled, piece by piece, like a building losing its scaffolding from the inside. And Briar, sitting 3 feet from her husband, watched every bolt drop. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I pulled the folder back toward me, opened it again, and placed my finger on the line item that started the unraveling. Page 4, I said. Consolidated balance. $36,000 predating Margot's birth by 18 months. That's not medical. That's not pediatric follow-up. That's personal debt you've been carrying since before my granddaughter existed. Wade shifted in his chair. That's it's grouped together for efficiency. The financial advisor suggested bundling. Which financial advisor? Because you are the financial advisor, Wade. That's what you tell people you do for a living. I turned to page 7. Medical cost projections here are 40% higher than what Levine's financial office quoted us last month. 40%. Either you inflated the numbers or you found a hospital on another planet. And the lender, I tapped the letterhead. Meridian Capital Partners. I looked them up while you were parking the car. Consumer complaint rating, that would make a payday loan shop blush. So tell me, what is this loan actually for? His jaw worked. I could see the muscles flexing beneath the skin, grinding through responses, discarding each one before it reached his mouth. He was running out of script. You're twisting everything, he said. I grouped things together for efficiency, that's all. This is about Margot. Everything I do is about Margot. Wade's entire life was built on the assumption that people don't turn to page 4. He married into the wrong family. Then you won't mind, I said, closing the folder but keeping my hand flat on top of it. If I have my attorney review it before I sign anything. The word attorney landed like a brick through a window. Wade's knuckles went white on the edge of my dining table. He stood up so fast his chair cracked against the hardwood behind him. Your attorney, he repeated. Right. Because that's what family does. Lawyers each other. He wasn't afraid of being told no. He was afraid of being known. And now he was. Every excuse he'd stacked like a house of cards, the grouped debts, the inflated projections, the predatory lender dressed up as a financial partner, I'd pulled them apart in front of the one person whose belief he needed most. His wife. My daughter. Wade grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and walked toward the front door. He didn't look at Briar. He didn't look at me. He looked straight ahead, the way men do when they're holding something together by refusing to acknowledge it's already broken. The front door closed harder than necessary. Not quite a slam, just enough force to say what his mouth couldn't. Briar didn't follow him. Not right away. My daughter sat at my dining table and watched her husband's story fall apart in front of her, and for the first time, she didn't rush to pick up the pieces. That silence was worth more than any argument I'd ever won. She stared at the loan folder still sitting between us. The pages fanned slightly where I'd turned them, exposing the debt consolidation line like a wound left open. She looked at it the way you look at something that just bit you, not with anger, but with vertigo. The ground she'd been standing on had shifted, and she was still figuring out how far it had fallen. Then she stood up, smoothed her jacket, walked out after her husband without saying a single word. Colleen came in from the kitchen doorway where she'd been standing since the first page turn. She put her hand on the back of my chair. She saw it, Colleen said quietly. She finally saw it. She saw a crack. That's not the same as seeing the whole building fall. I picked up the cold coffee neither of them had touched, took the last flat sip. That part's coming. I kept the loan documents. Every page. I photographed them one by one at the dining table, the quiet click of my phone camera, the only sound in the house. The coffee had gone metallic, and the trace of Wade's cologne still hung in the air like a ghost that didn't know it was dead. I sent the last photograph to Simone at 11:52 p.m. Then I sat in the dark and waited. Not for Wade's next move, I already knew what that would be. A cornered man with no money, no income, and a wife who just watched him stammer through his own paperwork doesn't get quiet. He gets loud, and he picks the worst possible stage to do it on. I just didn't know it would be my granddaughter's 6-month celebration. Margot weighed 11 pounds, 4 ounces, on the morning of her 6-month celebration, and for exactly 47 minutes. I believed the worst was behind us. The explosion I'd been expecting since that night at the dining table hadn't come yet. 2 weeks of silence from Wade. 2 weeks of Briar not calling. Colleen said maybe the quiet meant something was changing. I knew better. Quiet from a cornered man isn't peace. It's reload. But that morning at Levine Children's Hospital, with pink and white balloons crowding Margot's room and a onesie that read 6 months strong draped over the rail of her crib, I let myself pretend. Colleen held Margot against her chest. and my granddaughter's fingers curled around the collar of Colleen's blouse like she was anchoring herself to the safest person in the room. Dr. Prescott stopped by for a brief check, vitals stable, weight on track. The machine beside the crib tracing its steady green rhythm like a metronome, keeping time on a life we were all holding our breath for. Briar stood by the window, watching Colleen with Margot. And for the first time in months she looked at me without suspicion, without calculation. She was just a mother watching her daughter be held by a grandmother who loved her. I let myself believe that was enough. "She looks better," Colleen said quietly, adjusting Margot's blanket. "Both of them do." "Give it time," I said. Wade arrived 20 minutes late. He said parking was a nightmare, but his eyes weren't scanning for a chair. They were scanning for an audience. The walls in that wing were thin. The hallways echoed, and every parent on that floor was already running on fear. Wade didn't just make a scene. He weaponized the one place where everyone was too terrified to look away. It started in the corridor outside Margot's room. I'd stepped out to refill Colleen's water from the station near the nurse's desk. Wade followed me. His voice began low, the controlled register of a man who'd rehearsed this, but it climbed fast. "You killed that loan on purpose," he said. "You called them, didn't you? You made sure I'd have nothing, and then you sit here like you're the hero." His finger jabbed toward Margot's door. "You've been running this family like a board meeting since the day I married your daughter." I set the water cup on the counter, kept my back against the cool tile wall. "Wade, this is a children's hospital. Your daughter is in the next room." "Don't tell me where my daughter is." His voice cracked upward. A nurse at the station looked up. Two parents in the corridor stopped walking. "You want to talk about daughters? Let's talk about yours. Let's talk about what you really are to this family." He was leaking. Every accusation he threw contained a fragment of the truth he was trying to hide. The loan he'd designed to launder his own debts. The lender whose complaint file would bury him. The money he'd been hemorrhaging for months before Margot was ever born. I've been wrong about one thing. He didn't just get loud. He got reckless. And reckless men hand you everything they've been hiding. You just have to stand still long enough to catch it. Colleen appeared in the corridor. Her face was white. She put her hand on my forearm, not to pull me away, but to hold me steady, to remind me that I didn't need to swing back. The monitor beeped through the open door. Steady. Green. 12 feet from where a grown man was screaming about money in a cardiac ward. I stood perfectly still while he shouted the worst version of my life to a hallway full of strangers. And the only thing keeping me upright was knowing my granddaughter was 12 feet away, asleep under a cardiac monitor. Wade's voice finally broke. Not from emotion, from exhaustion. He'd spent everything he had, and the hallway gave him nothing back. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting, the beep of the monitor. The hum of the fluorescent lights flattening every face on the ward into the same pale, stunned expression. I thought Briar would pull him aside, tell him to stop. Do what she always did, smooth the surface and bury the damage underneath. But Briar didn't look at Wade. She was standing in the doorway of Margot's room, holding our granddaughter on her hip, and she was looking directly at me. The expression on her face wasn't his anger. It was her own. Something she'd been carrying longer than this afternoon. Longer than the loan, longer than anything Wade had put in her head. Her fingers tightened around Margot's blanket. "Dad," she said, then stopped, adjusted Margot on her left hip, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. And then she said the 6 words I will hear for the rest of my life. The same 6 words from the ICU, the ones I thought I understood before I knew what they really meant. She looked at me, and she said, "You're not a real father. You never were." The words arrived in pieces, the way a windshield cracks one point of impact, then fracture lines spreading until you can't see through it anymore. Byer's face was streaked with tears under the fluorescent light. Margot asleep against her shoulder. The cardiac monitor beeping its steady rhythm through the open door like the world hadn't just ended in that corridor. But she wasn't finished. "You adopted me because you couldn't have your own," she said, her voice cracking on the word own. "And now you think writing checks makes you Margot's savior? You're not saving her. You're buying her, the way you bought me." I'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 ways. In every version, I had something measured to say. Something that would cut through the noise and make her see. But standing in that hallway, with my daughter's voice ringing off the linoleum, I nothing. Colleen stepped forward. "Briar, that is enough. Stay out of this, Mom. You always stay out of it. That's the problem." Wade stood behind her. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His wife had just turned the one person paying for everything into the villain, and the look on his face wasn't shock. It was satisfaction. You want to know what it sounds like when your daughter tells you you're not real? It doesn't sound like anger. It sounds like relief, like she's been carrying a secret she finally got permission to say out loud. That's the part they don't warn you about in the adoption paperwork. I looked at Margot, still asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling, the monitor unchanged. My granddaughter didn't know that the man who'd paid for her heart to keep beating had just been told he wasn't family. I nodded once. Not at Briar. Not at Wade. At Margot. Then I turned and walked down the corridor. Colleen caught me at the elevator. Her hand reached for my arm and I stepped past it. Not because I was angry at her. Because if she touched me, I would break. "Stay with her," I said. "Both of them. Margot doesn't need to feel this. Garrison." She didn't mean you. She meant every word. That's the part that matters. The elevator took 11 seconds. I counted. Seconds staring at my own reflection in brushed steel. Trying to remember the last time my daughter called me Dad without it sounding like an accusation. Before I tell you what I did in that parking deck, before I explain the decision that changed everything after, comment your honest read was, Briar speaking from her own wound. Or reading from Wade's script, drop your answer and one reason why. A quick note, some details ahead are adapted for emotional depth. The core truth is what matters. I adopted Briar when she was 11 months old. Colleen and I chose her middle name together. The same night we signed the last of the paperwork, we kept a small mention of her birth mother folded into the family Bible so she'd always know where half of her came from. I said yes to everything because I thought love was enough. 27 years later, in a parking deck with headlights sweeping across the concrete ceiling, I learned that love without blood is a door that never fully locks. Anyone with the right key can kick it open. I sat in my car and cried, for the first time in 6 months. Not because my daughter hurt me, daughters hurt their fathers. That's the deal you sign when you hold them for the first time. It doesn't matter whether the hospital puts your name on the birth certificate or a judge does it 11 months later in a courtroom where a baby girl slept through the whole thing in her mother's arms. I cried because she was right about one thing. I wasn't her biological father. And no surgery, no trust fund, no midnight phone call to an attorney would change the double helix that connected her to someone else. The salt on my lips tasted like the coffee from the celebration that ended an hour ago. The leather steering wheel vibrated under my hands when I started the engine. Wade didn't create that wound. He just knew exactly where it was. That made him more dangerous than a con artist. That made him a surgeon cutting along a scar line someone else had left open 27 years ago. I sat in that parking deck for 45 minutes. Then I dried my face and called Simone. Not for revenge, because somewhere between the third-floor corridor and the ground-level concrete, I realized something Wade hadn't counted on. A man with nothing left to protect except a baby who shares none of his blood will do things a biological father never would. And I was about to prove it. Simone Gallagher answered on the second ring at 11 on a Thursday night, which told me everything I needed to know about how long she'd been waiting for this call. I was sitting in my home office in Myers Park. jacket still draped over the chair with the hospital smell baked into it. The loan photographs still open on my laptop. The blue glow of the screen was the only light in the room. I told Simone what happened at Levine. Wade's meltdown, Breyer's words, all of it. Concise. No self-pity. She listened without interrupting, which is what you pay a good attorney to do. When I finished, she asked one question. Garrison, I need to know, is this the grief talking? Or have you made a decision? I made a decision in the elevator. I'm calling you from the other side of it. Silence. Then the click of her keyboard. She was already pulling files. Do you want to protect Margot? Or do you want to punish Wade? Both, I said, in that order. I'd hired Simone 3 months ago because she was methodical. Tonight I needed her because she was ruthless. Those aren't the same skill set, but she had both. There are 2 kinds of phone calls you make at 11 at night. The kind where you're falling apart and need someone to catch you, and the kind where you've already hit the ground, stood back up, and need someone to hand you a weapon. Simone knew which one this was before I said a word. She laid out 2 tracks. Track 1 was clean. I stopped writing checks. Every indirect financial lifeline I'd been feeding Breyer and Wade through grocery deliveries. Utility payments, the car insurance I'd been covering since the wedding. All of it. Frozen. Nothing illegal about a man deciding to stop being generous. Track 2 takes longer, Simone said. Her voice was measured, precise, the way a surgeon sounds before the first incision. The loan documents you sent me show a pre-existing personal debt bundled into a $90,000 application with inflated medical projections. If that lender is who I think it is. Wade didn't just lie to you. He committed loan fraud. That's prosecutable. The word prosecutable hung in the dark office like a bell that had just been struck. I picked up the pen from my desk, started taking notes, never put it down. How long for track 2? If the lender cooperates. 4 to 6 weeks. If I have to subpoena, 8. Either way, by the time the second surgery comes around, we'll know exactly where every dollar went. 4 to 6 weeks. The surgery was scheduled for November. The math was tight, but the math was all I had left. My thumb pressed hard against the edge of the phone. The stale water I drank between sentences tasted like exhaustion. If you've never had to sit across a table from your own rage and decide which parts get to live and which parts have to die, you've never had to protect someone who can't protect themselves. Rage is easy. Precision is the thing that costs you. Simone paused. I could hear her weighing the next question before she asked it. And the surgery fund. The $180,000 for the second procedure. Do you want that? My answer was immediate. No hesitation, no negotiation. Don't touch the surgery, not 1 cent. That money goes to Levine the day Dr. Prescott says go. It never had Wade's name on it, and it never will. I didn't cut the surgery money. I cut everything feeding Wade's machinery, the quiet subsidies that let him pretend he was providing. The invisible scaffolding that held up his performance of competence. There's a difference between punishing a man and punishing a baby. If you can't see that difference, you shouldn't be making decisions for either one. Simone was quiet for a long time. The house settled around me. The cold coffee I'd poured hours ago sat untouched, and the faint antiseptic smell from my jacket drifted across the desk like a ghost from the corridor I'd walked out of 3 hours earlier. Then she said, "There's one more thing." Her keyboard stopped clicking. The forensic trace on Wade's accounts I got a preliminary flag this afternoon. I didn't want to tell you until I confirmed it, but given tonight, you should know. She took a breath. The money isn't just missing, Garrison. It's moving, and it's moving somewhere it shouldn't be. I set the pen down, stared at the photographs on my laptop, page after page, of a loan application built on lies. And now the lies had legs. How much? I asked. Simone didn't answer immediately. And that silence told me more than any number could. Colleen was sitting up in bed with the lamp off, which meant she'd been waiting. and which meant she already knew. Simone's final words were still circling in my head. The money is moving. I hadn't asked where, she hadn't offered. Some answers need daylight and documentation before they're safe to carry. And it was well past midnight. I loosened my tie in the dark hallway and pushed open the bedroom door. Colleen's silhouette sat upright against the headboard, hands folded in her lap. The only light was the nightlight, bleeding under the door from the hallway, casting a thin gold line across the carpet. She didn't ask how the call went. She waited. I sat on the edge of the bed and told her everything. The dual tracks, the frozen support, the forensic audit, the loan documents that showed fraud, not exaggeration, not carelessness, but the kind of fabrication that prosecutors build cases around. I didn't sugarcoat it. Colleen doesn't need things softened. She needs them straight. "When you say you froze everything," she said quietly, "the grocery help, the utilities, I've been covering through our account?" I turned to look at her. "You've been covering their utilities?" "Since August. Their power bill bounced twice. I set up an automatic transfer so Breyer wouldn't have to ask." She paused. "I was going to tell you." She'd been propping them up from a different angle, the same instinct. Different checkbook. Neither of us had told the other the full scope of what we'd been doing to keep our daughter's household from collapsing. And now all of it was frozen. "All of it," I confirmed. "They'll feel it within 2 weeks." 26 years of marriage teaches you one thing about hard conversations. The ones that matter never happen at the table with the lights on. They happen in the dark, side by side, where you don't have to look at each other's faces while you say the things that might break you both. The HVAC cycled on. The hum filled the silence between us like a held breath. "I trust you," Colleen said. "But I'm afraid we're losing our daughter, not to Wade, to this, to us becoming the people she thinks we are." She called me not real. Colleen. In a hospital hallway, holding our granddaughter. I know what she said. I was there. Her voice was steady but thin, the way a wire sounds right before it snaps. And I also know she was 7 when she made you promise to walk her down the aisle before she even understood what a wedding was. That girl is still in there. She's just buried under his voice right now. Colleen wasn't defending Breyer. She was reminding me who Breyer was before Wade, and asking me not to forget that person while I was busy fighting the one standing in front of us now. The lavender lotion on the sheets mixed with the faint antiseptic still clinging to my jacket. 2 worlds. The home we'd built, and the hospital where it was all unraveling. How do you explain to your wife that protecting your granddaughter might cost you your daughter? How do you promise that the math works out when every number on the board says someone is going to get hurt, and the only variable is who? "The surgery fund stays," I said. "Every dollar. That was never about Wade, and it never will be. But everything else, the invisible scaffolding that lets him pretend he's providing, that's done." Colleen was quiet for a long time. The mattress shifted as she moved closer. I felt her fingers find mine, in the dark warm. Deliberate, the way she reaches for me when she's about to say something she needs me to carry. "Promise me one thing," she said. "When she comes back, and she will come back, you don't make her beg. You just open the door." I squeezed her hand. "I'll open it, but she has to walk through it on her own." I took the last sip of water from the bedside glass. It was warm and flat. The taste of a room that had been closed all day, waiting for someone to come home and say the hard thing. My hands had finally stopped trembling. The tie sat coiled on the nightstand like something that had been holding me together, and didn't need to anymore. Colleen held my hand. We both knew the hardest part hadn't started yet. The surgery was 5 weeks away. The forensic audit was 3. And somewhere in between, our daughter was going to find out that everything her husband told her was a lie, and that everything her father did was the truth. I wasn't sure which one would hurt her more. Task 5.1. Dr. Prescott didn't ask us to sit down. She told us to. And that's how I knew the timeline had just collapsed. 3 weeks had passed since that night holding Colleen's hand in the dark. 3 weeks of frozen accounts, unanswered callings, and a forensic audit grinding forward while I waited for the numbers to tell me what I already knew. Now we were sitting in a consultation room at Levine, and the numbers had changed again, but not the ones I'd been watching. The echocardiogram was on the wall-mounted screen behind Dr. Prescott's shoulder. I'm not a cardiologist, but I've spent 18 years reading data that other people don't want me to understand. The valve image looked wrong, thinner, more irregular than the last scan. Margot's baby powder scent drifted from Briar's arms, cutting through the antiseptic like something alive in a room full of machines. The valve isn't holding the way we projected, Dr. Prescott said. Her pen clicked against her clipboard once. We're back to the 3-week window I warned you about. If we wait longer, we're talking about acute heart failure in an infant. And that's a conversation none of us wants to have. Briar's knuckles went white around Margot's blanket. 3 weeks. You said late November. We were supposed to have time. The heart doesn't negotiate timelines, Mrs. Kendrick. We operate by the 21st, or we accept a risk profile I'm not comfortable with. November 21st. The forensic audit wouldn't be finished for another 2 weeks after that. The math that was already tight had just become impossible. Colleen's hand found my forearm under the table and gripped it the same anchor. Different storm. The fund that everyone believed in. The anonymous charity that covered the first surgery. The one Briar had thanked God for. The one Wade had privately dismissed as a tax write-off. Was me. And I'd just frozen myself. Dr. Prescott excused herself. The silence she left behind had weight. 4 adults, a sleeping baby, and not one of us speaking. The steady beep from the next room carried through the wall. Margot's heartbeat, steady for now, counting down to a deadline that had just moved up by 2 weeks. Briar broke the silence first. What about the fund, the charity that covered the first surgery? Can we contact them again? There has to be a way to... We can look into it, Colleen said carefully. I said nothing. The bitter hospital coffee sat untouched in front of me, and the taste of every word I swallowed sat at the back of my throat like metal. Wade cleared his throat. I'll handle the financial side. I've been talking to lenders. There are options. There were no options. His credit was destroyed. His income had evaporated months ago. The lender he'd been working with was the one whose fraudulent application was sitting in Simone's evidence file. Wade wasn't offering a plan. He was performing one the same way he'd performed competence, performed partnership, performed fatherhood for 4 years. But the performance was thinner now. His face had gone from camera-ready to ashen in the time it took Dr. Prescott to say 5 words. We're back to 3 weeks. A con artist is only dangerous when he has options. Take away the options and he becomes something worse. He becomes honest. And an honest version of Wade. Standing in a hospital with no money, no plan, and a baby whose heart was failing, was the most unpredictable version of him I'd ever seen. The family moved toward the corridor. Colleen walked with Briar, one hand on her back, murmuring something I couldn't hear. I hung back to check my phone. The weight of it in my pocket had been pulling at me since Dr. Prescott's first sentence. Simone needed to know the timeline had accelerated. Everything had to move faster now. Wade didn't follow the others. He stood in the hallway after everyone else had walked away. The pale hospital glow flattened his features into something I barely recognized. He opened his mouth, closed it. Then he did something I'd never seen him do in 4 years of marriage to my daughter. He dropped his shoulders, let his hands fall to his sides, and looked at me the way a drowning man looks at the only boat in the water. Not the coffee shop sneer, not the dining table performance, not the hospital corridor rage from the celebration. This was raw. This was a man who had burned every bridge, spent every dollar, exhausted every lie, and was staring at a wall he couldn't talk his way through with a baby on the other side of it. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Contempt I could handle. Contempt came from a man who thought he was smarter than me. But desperation came from a man who finally knew he wasn't. And that made him more dangerous than ever. I knew what was coming. Not from Wade. Wade was finished. Briar was going to call, and she was going to do the one thing she swore she'd never do. She was going to beg. She didn't call, she came in person. Which meant she'd practiced what she was going to say and knew it wouldn't survive a phone line. 2 days after Wade's desperate look in the hallway, I was sitting alone outside Margot's room when Briar came around the corner. No makeup. Hair pulled back with a rubber band, not a clip. Dark circles that turned her 28 years into something closer to 40. She sat down in the plastic chair beside me without asking permission, the first time she'd voluntarily been within arm's reach since the 6-month celebration. "I don't know how to start this conversation," she said, staring at the floor. "I've been sitting in the parking lot for 40 minutes trying to figure out what to say to you, and I still don't have it." I recognized the distance she kept. 3 feet. Close enough to touch. Far enough to run. The same distance I'd felt from her as a teenager. The year she first asked why her eyes didn't match mine. Close enough to hope. Far enough to survive the answer. Her shampoo reached me for the first time in months. The same brand she'd used since high school. Familiar as a language I thought she'd stop speaking. You don't have to have the right words. Briar. Just say what you came to say. My daughter sat 3 feet away from me in a hospital corridor and asked me for money to save her baby's life. The same daughter who screamed I wasn't real 3 weeks earlier. And I want you to understand something. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel powerful. I felt like a father whose child was finally close enough to reach. And I was terrified of using the wrong hand. "I need help," she said. "Margot needs help. Wade tried every lender, every option, there's nothing. And the fund that covered the first surgery won't return our calls." She clasped her hands in her lap the same way she clasped them in the family photo from her adoption day, 27 years ago. Fingers woven tight. Like she was holding herself together from the inside. "I don't know where else to go. I know what I said to you. I know what I called you. And I'm asking anyway because my daughter's heart is failing. And pride doesn't fix that." The monitor beeped through the cracked door. Margot's heartbeat. Steady. For now. Briar's voice broke on the next sentence. "What I said in that hallway, about you not being real, I shouldn't have..." She stopped, swallowed. Her hand moved toward my arm, then pulled back. "I'm not blaming him. Those were my words. I own them. But they weren't all of me. They were the worst of me. And I'm sorry you had to hear the worst of me in front of everyone. A partial apology from a drowning woman isn't the same as a real one. But it was the first time in 6 months my daughter had spoken to me like I was her father and not her enemy. And I decided that was enough to work with." The HVAC hummed above us. The antiseptic smell had become almost comforting, the scent of the place where my granddaughter was still alive, still fighting. I leaned my head against the cool wall behind me and let the silence sit. "What do you do when your daughter begs you for help she doesn't know you've already given? Do you let her keep believing in the lie that makes you invisible? Or do you tell the truth that might make her hate you for a completely different reason?" I could have said yes. Written the check. Let her believe a stranger saved her daughter twice and that her father only showed up when she begged. It would have been easier. Cleaner. She'd never have to know that the fun she thanked God for came from the man she told wasn't real. I could have stayed invisible. Stayed safe. But I was done being safe. Safe hadn't protected Margot from Wade's fraud. Safe hadn't kept my daughter from screaming my worst fear in a hospital corridor. Safe was a locked room where I sat alone with the truth while everyone I loved made decisions based on lies. I tasted salt at the corners of my mouth. Tears I didn't realize had started. The bitter vending machine coffee sat untouched on the floor between us. And the truth I'd been carrying for 6 months sat at the back of my throat like a stone I'd swallowed whole. Briar, I need to tell you something, I said. And when I'm done, you're going to be angry. Maybe angrier than you were in that hallway. But you deserve the truth more than you deserve my silence. She looked at me. Not with anger, with confusion. The kind of confusion that comes right before the ground shifts. I took a breath. There is no charity fund. There never was. The first surgery, every dollar of it, that was me. And I need you to hear the rest before you say a word. My daughter didn't interrupt me once, and that silence was louder than anything she'd ever screamed. I'd moved us into the private consultation room down the hall from Margot's ward. Closed the door. Sat across from Briar at a table meant for doctors delivering diagnoses, and delivered one of my own. I spread the documents between us. Wire confirmations, payment receipts, the P.O. box routing, and I started at the beginning. This is the wire confirmation from June 4th, I said, sliding the first printout across the table. Routed through Simone's office so it would look anonymous. This is the utility payment schedule Colleen set up in August when your power bill bounced twice. And this, I placed the last page in front of her, is the letter you wrote thanking the charity. It went to a P.O. box Simone opened in June. Briar's hands were flat on the table, fingers spread, pressing down like the room was tilting, and she needed something solid to hold on to. She hadn't blinked in 30 seconds. The consultation room smelled like cleaning product and stale coffee and paper cups neither of us had touched. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me, I said. I didn't want Wade to know because... I stopped, chose the next words carefully. Because I already knew what he would do with that information. The wire confirmation sat between us like evidence in a trial where my daughter was the only juror. The fluorescent light caught the bank stamps, the dates, the amounts, each one a line in a ledger of love she didn't know existed. You want to know what it looks like when someone realizes they've been loved in secret for 6 months? It doesn't look like gratitude. It looks like horror. Because gratitude means you knew, and horror means you didn't. And everything you did in the dark was lit by a spotlight you couldn't see. Briar was quiet for a long time. I could hear her breathing go shallow, uneven. The rhythm of a woman whose entire understanding of the last 6 months was rearranging itself in real time. Then the timeline hit her. I watched it land. June, she whispered. Her voice had no edges left. You paid in June. She covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook. The sound that came through her fingers wasn't a word. It was something older than language. The sound of shame, arriving all at once instead of in pieces. And in October, I stood in that hallway. She couldn't finish. I didn't reach for her. Not because I didn't want to, because I'd learned. Over 20 years of being Briar's father, that the moments when she most needed to be held were the exact moments she needed space to fall apart on her own terms. If I touched her now, she'd pull away. If I waited, she'd come to me. My hands stayed in my lap. Every instinct I had screamed to cross the 3 feet between us, and I overruled every one. She looked up. Mascara tracked down her cheeks, catching the overhead light. Why didn't you just tell me? Why did you let me believe? Because the day you stop needing to be told is the day you actually hear it. I was waiting for today. 20 years of fatherhood. 11 of adoption. 6 months of anonymous checks. 4 months of silence. And 1 sentence in a hospital hallway that my daughter would give anything to take back. That's the math. It doesn't balance. It was never supposed to. Briar wiped her face with the back of her hand. She stared at the documents, the wire confirmation, the utility schedule, the thank you letter she'd written to a stranger who turned out to be the man sitting across from her. She was quiet for so long I could hear the corridor sounds bleeding through the closed door. A nurse's shoes, a cartwheel, the distant, steady beep that meant my granddaughter's heart was still going. Then she said it. So the man I called not real. Her voice broke. She swallowed, tried again. The man I told wasn't her father. She pressed her forehead against the cold table, and the rest came out in pieces, muffled and wrecked. Saved my baby's life. I let her cry. I sat 3 feet away and let my daughter break into pieces on a hospital table. Because sometimes being a father means being close enough to catch someone and choosing not to. So they can learn they're strong enough to stand back up on their own. She lifted her head, eyes swollen, voice destroyed. And the question she asked next was the one I'd been dreading more than anything she'd said in that hallway. "If you paid for everything," she said slowly, "then where did Wade's money go? The loans, the lender, the money he said he needed, Dad. Where did all of Wade's money go?" I should have locked the door before I dialed Simone. But part of me, the part I'm not proud of, already knew I wouldn't. Briar's question was still hanging in the consultation room air. Where did Wade's money go? She deserved to hear the answer from the person who found it. I set my phone face up on the table between us and called Simone on speaker. Simone answered in 2 rings. I told her Briar was in the room. Simone paused for exactly 1 second. The pause of a woman recalibrating her delivery from attorney to client to attorney to audience. And then she began. The interim trust account established in September showed 3 unauthorized withdrawals between September and October, Simone said. Her voice was measured, precise, filling the small room like a verdict being read. Total $41,000. The routing traces back to an account in Wade's name at a different institution. The same account that received the debt consolidation from the loan application you flagged. He used Margot's trust to service his own debt. I watched Briar's face. She didn't cry this time. She went somewhere past crying, somewhere cold and still, like a lake that just froze over. I'd seen that expression once before, in a photograph from the day the adoption became final. An infant's face, gone still and watchful in a stranger's courtroom, too young to understand what was happening and somehow bracing for it anyway. The same stillness, the same distance. A child learning that the people who were supposed to protect her had failed. He stole from his own baby. Not from a stranger, not from a corporation, not from a father-in-law he resented from a 6-month-old girl with a heart defect who couldn't sit up yet, let alone defend her own trust fund. That's not financial fraud. That's something the law doesn't have a strong enough word for. He took money from Margot's account. Briar's voice was barely audible. From her? From the babies? From the trust designated for her medical care. Simone confirmed. Yes. Briar stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor. She gripped the edge of the table with both hands and stared at the phone like it was a window into a room she'd been locked out of for months. The $75,000 he asked you for that July, she said, looking at me. That wasn't for the baby either, was it? Simone answered before I could. Based on the account activity, no. The timing corresponds with a personal credit settlement and a vehicle lease he was underwater on. Every time, Briar whispered. Every time he said it was from Margot. Every time he told me we needed more money for the baby, he was lying. To me, about our daughter, she pointed at me. While you were the one actually paying for everything, and I called you not real. The consultation room felt like it was shrinking. The staleness of a conversation that had been going on too long pressed against the walls. Briar's stress cut through the clinical air like something chemical. There's a moment in every con where the con artist walks into a room and realizes the room already knows. The air changes. The temperature drops, and every lie he's ever told is sitting in the chairs, waiting for him. Wade Kendrick walked into that moment at 2:47 on a Tuesday in November. The door opened. Wade stood in the frame, backlit by the corridor fluorescence. Simone's voice was still coming through the speaker. The third withdrawal, dated October 9th, was $14,000 routed to the same personal account. At that point, the trust balance was functionally depleted. If the second surgery had been billed against that account, it would have been. Wade heard it. All of it. His wife's swollen eyes, his father-in-law's phone on the table, his crimes being read aloud in an attorney's cadence like items on a receipt. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He stood in that doorway the way a man stands when the last door in the last hallway has just closed behind him. "Tell me she's wrong," Breyer said. Her voice was flat. No tears, no shaking, just iron. "Look at me and tell me you didn't steal from daughter." Wade said nothing. The corridor air rushed in behind him, carrying the distant beep of Margot's monitor like a heartbeat from another world. Simone went quiet on the speaker. The room held its breath. For 5 seconds, the longest 5 seconds of my life, nobody moved. Then Breyer took her wedding ring off. Not fast, not dramatic. Slowly. The way you remove something that's been burning your finger for months, and you only just notice the heat. She set it on the table next to my phone. The soft metallic clink was the loudest sound in the room. Wade looked at the ring, then at me, then at the woman he'd married, who was already looking through him like glass. Wade didn't run, and that was the first honest thing he'd done in 6 months. The door closed behind him. The ring sat on the table. Simone's voice had gone quiet on the speaker. And Wade stood inside the consultation room, with nowhere left to go except the truth. He tried one more time. "It was temporary," he said. His voice was hoarse. Stripped of the rehearsed confidence I'd heard at every meeting, every pitch, every performance. I was going to replace it. The loan was supposed to cover everything, and then I'd put the trust money back. I didn't steal from Margot. I borrowed. "You borrowed from a baby with a heart defect," Breyer said. "Stop talking." He didn't stop. "Breyer, you have to understand, the income dried up. The mortgage was underwater. I couldn't tell you we were—" "You couldn't tell me?" Breyer's voice was flat iron. No tears, no trembling. "You told me every week it was handled. You told me you had a plan. You told me my father was the problem." She pointed at the phone on the table. "And the whole time you were taking money out of our daughter's medical fund to pay for a car lease." Wade's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Every exit was blocked. Every lie was cataloged. Every dollar was traced. His shoulders caved inward, and he dropped into the chair by the door, put his face in his hands, and stopped talking. Not because he chose to, because there was nothing left to say. You want to know what a con artist looks like when the con is over? He doesn't look dangerous. He doesn't look clever. He looks small. Wade Kendrick, sitting in a hospital chair with his face in his hands, was the smallest man I'd ever seen, and I'd watched him perform as the biggest for 4 years. I let the silence hold for 10 seconds. Then I spoke. "I'm going to say this once." My voice was level. I'd rehearsed it on the drive over, but I didn't need the rehearsal. Some things come out exactly right when you've been carrying them long enough. The second surgery will be paid in full. Dr. Prescott will have the funds before the end of the week. That money is for Margot. It has nothing to do with you, Wade, and it never did. Wade didn't look up. "Second, every dollar that has gone to you, through you, or near you is done. Permanently. I don't fund the people who steal from my granddaughter." I paused. The overhead lights hummed above us. Wade's sweat cut through the hospital sterility like something chemical. "Third, Simone will file a formal fraud complaint with the Mecklenburg County DA's office on Monday. What happens after that is between you and the state of North Carolina." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. There is a kind of anger that shouts and a kind that speaks in complete sentences with correct punctuation. The second kind is the one that ends careers, marriages, and the particular brand of confidence that lets a man steal from a baby and sleep through the night. Colleen stood by the door. She didn't interrupt, she didn't soften it. She'd promised to open the door when Breyer came back, and Breyer was back. But Colleen had never promised to open it for Wade. Wade stood up. He looked at Breyer. She didn't look back. He looked at me. I held his gaze until he broke it. Then he walked out. No door slam, no parting shot. Just the quiet click of a man leaving a room where everything he'd built had been dismantled in under an hour. The monitor beeped faintly through the wall. Steady, indifferent to all of it. Breyer reached across the table and picked up her ring. She looked at it for a long time, turning it once between her fingers, the overhead light catching the band. Then she put it in her pocket. Not on her finger, in her pocket. A quiet, permanent decision that didn't need a speech. Colleen crossed the room and sat beside her daughter. Put her hand on Breyer's shoulder. Breyer didn't pull away. She leaned in, just barely. Just enough, and Colleen held steady. I watched from across the table. The exhaustion sat bitter at the back of my throat, the strange, flat taste of a victory that doesn't feel like one. The room was silent. For the first time in months, it was a fair silence. Not the silence of someone hiding, not the silence of someone being lied to. Just 3 people and a baby sleeping down the hall, whose heart was about to be repaired by a grandfather who never once needed to be called real to know that he was. The surgery was paid for, the fraud was filed, and the hardest part, the part none of us were ready for, was just beginning. 7 hours. That's how long it takes to rebuild a valve in a heart the size of a plum. And every minute of it aged me a year. The surgery was scheduled for the 21st, exactly as Dr. Prescott demanded. The funds cleared the hospital's account 3 days early, and on a Tuesday morning in late November, Colleen, Breyer, and I sat in the surgical waiting room at Levine while Wade's chair stayed empty. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. I drank terrible coffee from the burner that had been running since dawn. The waiting room clock ticked loud enough to hear between heartbeats. Breyer sat across from me with her hands folded in her lap, the same posture, the same clasped fingers, and for 7 hours we existed in a silence that was no longer hostile. It was just scared. Dr. Prescott came through the double doors, still in blue scrubs, her clogs squeaking on the linoleum. She was tired, but she was smiling. "The repair is holding," she said. "Oxygen saturation is strong. She's going to need monitoring for 6 months, but I'm optimistic." Colleen made a sound I'd never heard from her, half gasp, half prayer. Breyer covered her mouth with both hands and folded forward in her chair. Then Dr. Prescott turned to me. She extended her hand. I took it. She held it 2 beats longer than a handshake and said, quietly enough that the words were meant for the 3 of us and no one else, "You saved her. Twice." Nobody in this family knew both times. But I did. Dr. Prescott's handshake was the receipt. 20 years of fatherhood. 6 months of silence. Every dollar I'd routed through Simone's office. 1 sentence in a corridor that almost ended everything. And a surgeon who'd known the truth since June and never said a word. That handshake settled the account. Breyer watched it. She watched the way Dr. Prescott held my hand. Not a polite gesture between a doctor and a worried grandfather, but an acknowledgement between 2 people who shared a secret that had just saved a life. And Breyer understood, fully, finally. "Both times," she whispered. "Both times," I said. The weeks that followed moved fast and quiet. Simone called on a Monday in December. Wade had been formally charged. Fiduciary fraud, misappropriation of funds designated for a minor. The DA's office took the case. A man who steals from his own infant's surgical trust makes for a clean prosecution and an ugly headline. Simone restructured the trust under independent management. My contributions, her oversight. No signatory access for anyone named Kendrick. I told her to make it permanent. Breyer filed for separation the same week. She didn't call me to discuss it. Didn't ask for advice. She just did it quietly. Cleanly. the way I'd taught her to handle things that hurt too much to talk about. I was proud of her, and I was heartbroken for her. Both at the same time. Colleen had kept the guest room ready for 2 months. Clean sheets, a nightlight, a crib borrowed from the Hargrove family next door. She never told me. She just prepared for the homecoming she believed in while I prepared for the war I was certain of. One of us was right. I'm glad it was her. It was a January evening, cold enough that the air bit the inside of your nose. I heard tires on the gravel driveway and opened the front door before the engine cut off. Briar was standing on the porch with Margot in a carrier and 2 suitcases with handles worn smooth from being carried too far. She didn't ask to come in. She just stood there the way I imagined she must have stood swaddled in a blanket on this same porch 27 years ago, the day Colleen and I carried her inside for the first time. A baby who couldn't yet ask the question her whole life would eventually form. Now she was 28, with a baby and 2 suitcases. And the question was the same. The January air rushed in sharp and clean. The familiar scent of the house wood polish and Colleen's cooking drifted past me, toward my daughter like an outstretched hand. Colleen appeared behind me. "The guest room is ready," she said. "It's been ready for 2 months. "Mom!" Briar's voice cracked. "Come inside, sweetheart. Both of you. Come home." Briar carried Margot through the front door and into the house where she'd grown up. She stopped in the hallway right where the family photographs hung and looked at the one from her adoption day. 11 months old. A courthouse hallway. A father who wouldn't put her down long enough for the photographer to focus. She turned to me and opened her mouth, and I braced myself because in this family, every time my daughter opens her mouth in a hallway, the world changes. Do you know how long it takes an adopted child to stop testing whether the love is real? And do you know what happens when they finally stop? Briar didn't say the thing I braced for. Not yet. She looked at the adoption photograph for a long moment, then turned to me and said, "Can we sit down? Just us?" Colleen had taken Margot upstairs for a nap. The house was quiet in the way January houses get when the heating clicks off and the walls hold their breath. Briar sat across from me in the living room. The same table where Wade had spread his fraudulent loan documents months ago, the same chairs. Different conversation. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. The creases were soft from being handled too many times. "I wrote it down because I've been practicing for 3 days and I still can't get through it without crying," she said. "So I'm going to read it. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything. Please." She was holding that paper the way she used to hold her book reports in 3rd grade, folded twice, edges worn, fingers white at the corners. My 28-year-old daughter, sitting in my living room, about to read me an apology she'd rehearsed like a school presentation. I nodded. I didn't trust my own voice either. "Take your time," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." My daughter wrote me an apology on a piece of paper she'd folded and unfolded so many times the creases were furring at the edges. She rehearsed it for 3 days. She waited until the baby was asleep and her mother was upstairs. And she read it to me the way a child reads to a parent, terrified of getting the words wrong, desperate to be understood. She was 28 years old. She was also still 11. She unfolded the paper. 1 crease, then 2. Took a breath. "I told you you weren't real," she read. "I said it in front of nurses and doctors and my own mother and my baby. I said it because there's a part of me, a part I've carried since I was 11 that was afraid it might be true. Not because of anything you did, because of what happened before you. And instead of telling you I was afraid, I turned the fear into a weapon and aimed it at the person who least deserved it." Her voice caught. She swallowed, pressed the paper flat against her knee, and kept going. "You paid to save my daughter's life and you never told me? You watched me thank a charity that didn't exist. You sat alone in a parking deck and cried because I told you you weren't her real father?" The paper was shaking now. And then you paid for the second surgery too. I don't know how to apologize for that. I don't know if there are words big enough. But I know you were always my real father. I just wasn't brave enough to see past my own fear. She put the paper down. Her hands were shaking so badly, the words would have been unreadable anyway. She looked at me not the way she looked at me in the hospital hallway, or the consultation room, or the porch. She looked at me the way I'd always imagined she must have looked at me as a baby in that courtroom. When the judge asked if I understood I was taking on a father's full weight. And I said yes. I didn't need the apology. I need you to understand that. I didn't need her to say she was sorry. I needed her to say she was scared. Because sorry is what you say when you've done something wrong. Scared is what you say when you're finally ready to do something right. I crossed the room, sat beside my daughter, put my arms around her the way I held her the day the adoption was finalized, carefully, like holding something I'd waited too long to pick up. Her fingers gripped the back of my shirt the way a child holds on. She cried. I cried. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Breyer's shampoo was against my shoulder, the same brand since high school, and the wood-polish smell of the living room wrapped around us like a room that remembered who we were. When I finally spoke, it was 3 sentences. That was enough. You were brave enough at 11 to choose a new family. You were brave enough today to come back to it. That's 2 for 2 in my book, and I stopped keeping score a long time ago. We sat in that living room until the light changed. Breyer fell asleep with her head on my shoulder the way she used to at 12 when she pretended she wasn't tired. Upstairs. Colleen was singing to Margot. Every sound in my house belonged to someone I loved. February was coming. Margot's 9-month milestone party was 3 weeks away. And I had one more thing to say, but this time, I'd say it in front of everyone. Margot took her first steps 9 months into a fight for her life, 3 wobbling. Furious steps across the backyard grass, and every person who helped keep her heart beating was there to watch her fall. February had come, the way good things do when you've stopped expecting them. Quietly. The Myers Park backyard was strung with balloons Colleen had hung at dawn. A smash cake sat on the picnic table, already listing to one side in the afternoon sun. The guest list was small, the people who stayed. No one mentioned the person who didn't. Margot was 9 months old. Healthy. Loud. Frosting on her cheeks and fingers, and somehow in her left ear. She stood up on the grass, wobbled, locked her eyes on Breyer's outstretched hands, and launched. 3 steps. 3 furious, unsteady, ridiculous steps before she toppled sideways into the grass. Laughing like falling was the funniest thing that had ever happened to her. "She's walking," Colleen said from behind her phone. "Filming everything. Garrison, are you seeing this?" I was seeing it. I was seeing all of it. She fell. They always fall. But she fell toward her mother's hands, and that's the only direction that matters. 1 year. 2 surgeries, 1 fraud case grinding through the Mecklenburg County courts. 1 daughter lost and found. And here was Margot frosting on her face. Grass stains on her knees, trying to cross a backyard like the whole world was hers. She didn't know what it cost to keep her heart beating. She never will. That's the point. That's the whole point of being a father. The afternoon went the way good afternoons go. Cake, photographs, Colleen organizing everyone into positions they'd never hold naturally. Breyer carried Margot on her hip with the ease of a woman who'd stopped carrying everything else, the pretenses, the defenses, the husband who used her daughter's name as a line of credit. She was lighter now. I could see it in the way she moved. After the cake. After the last guest left. Breyer found me on the porch. The February sun was going down over the roofline, and the air had that cool, clean edge that makes you believe winter is almost done. She didn't say anything at first. She just walked up and put her arms around me, not the careful, measured contact of the past few weeks. The full weight of a daughter holding her father. her face pressed against my chest. Her shampoo, the same brand since high school, filled the space between us, like a language we'd both been too stubborn to speak. "You were always her real father," she said. "You were always mine. I just didn't deserve you." "You always deserved me," I said. "You just forgot for a while. So did I." The same 6 words rearranged. The sentence that nearly ended us turned right side up. It took 9 months, 2 surgeries, and every dollar I could find. But the line finally landed the way it was always supposed to. 20 years of fatherhood doesn't earn you a title. It doesn't earn you gratitude or the guarantee that your daughter won't break your heart in a hospital corridor. It earns you one thing the moment she stops testing and starts trusting. That moment is the entire salary. And it's enough. Briar let go, wiped her eyes, went inside to help Colleen with Margot's bath. And I stood on that porch and watched the sun go down over Myers Park and tasted the February air, cool and clean. The salt of the last tears I'd cry in this story still drying on my face. Not grief, not relief, just the taste of something finally finished. That night, the house was quiet. Colleen was asleep. Briar was asleep down the hall, in the room that used to be hers. In the bed she slept in when she was 12 and afraid of thunderstorms, and I'd sit in the doorway until the storm passed. Margot was asleep in the crib beside her mother. I stood in the dark with my hand on the smooth wooden rail and listened. No cardiac monitor now, no machines. Just her own lungs and her own repaired heart, rising and falling in the nightlight's glow. The baby powder scent of her nursery wrapped around me like something holy. They can say you're not a real father. They can scream it in hospital hallways and whisper it at kitchen tables and use it as a weapon when they're scared and cornered and married to the wrong person. But the heart beating in that tiny chest steady. Sure. Repaired twice by a surgeon who knew my name before my daughter did. That heartbeat is the only proof I ever needed. I was real. I was always real. And the heart keeps beating. And to you listening to my story, remember it seriously. I spent 9 months hiding behind silence because I thought love was supposed to be invisible. I thought if I paid quietly, protected quietly, absorbed every insult quietly, my daughter would eventually see the truth on her own. And she did. But not before I sat alone in a parking deck, crying over 6 words that nearly broke me. Don't make my mistake. If you love someone, don't wait for them to figure it out from the shadows. Silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's just loneliness wearing a brave face. This wasn't a revenge story in the way most people think of revenge stories. Nobody got even. Nobody celebrated someone else's downfall. The real revenge story was choosing to keep paying for a baby's heart surgery while the man who was supposed to be her father stole from her trust fund, and doing it anyway. The best revenge story is the one where love outlasts the people who tried to weaponize it. I believe God put me through this so I could stand over that crib 9 months into her fight and hear the only proof I ever needed a heartbeat. His timing was better than mine ever was. If this revenge story hit you somewhere real, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, would you have revealed the truth or stayed invisible? There's no wrong answer. If someone in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. Thank you for listening to every word. Some details in this story were fictionalized for storytelling and emotional depth. But the message that real fatherhood isn't written in blood. It's written in what you do when nobody's watching. That part is as true as it gets.